Imagine you're just a technician fixing comms arrays when an alien assassin puts a blade to your throat. She says you're marked for termination, but here's the twist. Killing you would start an interstellar war. Your ordinary maintenance logs hold evidence of a conspiracy that spans governments and arms dealers. Now you're trapped with the professional killer sent to eliminate you, forced into an alliance that could save civilizations or destroy them both. Every station has a sound you stop hearing after the third shift. For Thomas Harper, it was the low thrum of quantum relays working like a tired heart in the belly of a metal beast. He drank synthetic coffee that tasted like ground wires and listened. Most days, the sound was just there, the way your own breathing is just there. But sometimes you catch a flicker in the rhythm, a hesitation where there shouldn't be one, and suddenly you can't ignore it anymore. Your teeth set on edge, your hands still. His station wasn't just noisy, it was a chorus of overlapping systems, each humming its own note. The life support wheezed. The gravity generators groaned. The comms array chattered. Thomas knew the score of it by muscle memory. He could tell a coolant leak from a power surge just by the way the deck plates vibrated under his boots. But lately the music was off. Not broken, not yet. Just wrong. He'd filed 17 reports in 3 weeks. Anomaly in diplomatic packet encryption. Echoes in the long-range antenna alignment. Background radiation spikes that matched no known stellar event. Each report got the same automated reply, logged. No further action required. He'd read them before sending each time. The words looked smaller on the screen each time he typed them. Glitches, they said. Minor system noise. Routine fluctuations. He began to drink his coffee colder, faster. The bitterness suited the mood. Each ignored memo felt like another turn of a key in a lock he couldn't see. The station hummed on, indifferent. But in his skull the sound had changed. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't tinnitus. It was data, raw and pleading, screaming to be heard under layers of automated peacekeeping and bureaucratic static. He'd lie in his bunk and hear it, a high, thin frequency weaving through the normal drone, a thread of pure signal in a tapestry of noise. The diplomatic channels were the worst. They were supposed to sound clean, encrypted, secure, the voice of interspecies politics, crisp and professional. But under the sanctioned words, he'd begun to catch it. A shadow frequency, a second conversation happening in the gaps between syllables. It didn't translate. It wasn't meant to. It was just there. A toxic whisper in a river of formal pleasantries. He was the only one who noticed. The only one whose job was to listen to the machine, not the message. That made him a problem. Not a person causing trouble, but a component malfunctioning. A sensor picking up a reading that contradicted the official dashboard. On a station built for diplomacy, the last thing anyone wanted was a technician who heard things in the walls. He spent his off hours rerouting diagnostics, running unauthorized deep-level scans on subsystems nobody had looked at in years. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even particularly brave. He was just thorough. A man who couldn't leave a broken thing unfixed. His routine maintenance logs, the dullest documents on the station, began to fill with encrypted fragments he didn't understand. Error codes that shouldn't exist. Routing paths that led to dead ends in the comms network. Data ghosts. He'd just cataloged another one, a signal bounce that indicated a non-regulation receiver hidden somewhere in the cargo sector, when the air in his workshop shifted. The hum of the station didn't change. The lights didn't flicker, but the quality of the silence around him did. It was the silence of a breath held, the silence of a predator stepping into the room. Then the assassin arrived. She wore the darkness like it was part of her uniform. Zarath Midnightborn didn't so much enter the workshop as she unfolded from its shadows, her arrival a sudden cold fact in the room. You could be forgiven for staring at the tattoos first. Bioluminescent patterns that coiled up her arms and neck, a soft cyan glow that pulsed slowly, like a creature breathing in the deep. They weren't for show. They were species identification, rank, and a dozen other data points he couldn't hope to decipher. His eyes tried to trace the lines to make sense of the shifting light, but they kept getting drawn back to her hand, to the blade in it. The weapon was a curve of polished, non-reflective metal shaped like a new moon. It didn't gleam. It seemed to drink the light from the room. She held it with a casual certainty that said she'd been born with it in her hand. There was no wasted motion, no theatrical flourish. She was just there, and the blade was there, and the point of it was aimed at a spot just below his sternum. Her voice was as flat and calm as a system alert. Thomas Harper. Designation Echo 7. She didn't snarl it. She didn't hiss it. She stated it, the way a sensor reads a temperature. It was a confirmation of parameters. Target acquired. There was no hatred in her eyes, no pleasure. If he had to put a word to it, it was focus. A pure, undistracted focus on the task. He wasn't a man to her. He was a line item on a work order, a minor malfunction in the station's operating system that required a physical patch, a deletion. His own mind scrambled for purchase, trying to fit this impossible situation into a framework he understood. This violated protocol. Her presence alone was a breach of a dozen diplomatic treaties. There were security scans, identity verifications, customs waivers for non-human sentience. His brain, trained on manuals and flowcharts, presented him with a list of violations. She shouldn't be here. The weapon was a non-regulation design. He opened his mouth to cite a regulation, to ask for her authorization codes to do something, anything that would make this make sense. But the words died. Her gaze didn't waver. She wasn't here on the books. She wasn't here with permission. The order to erase him hadn't come through official channels. It had come from the spaces between them, from the unspoken agreements and the shadow economies that ran alongside the bright, clean world of interspecies diplomacy. People whose names were never spoken into microphones. People who signed contracts with a nod and a silence. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't even personal. It was logistics. He had become a variable in a calculation, and the outcome of that math was his termination. A political problem required a permanent solution. She was the instrument of that solution, a highly specialized, brutally efficient tool. But as he stood there, feeling the cold air on his skin and watching the slow pulse of her tattoos, he realized something else. She was the instrument, but he was the key. The why of it was locked inside the very data he'd been collecting. The silence he was threatening to break with his tedious reports and his inconvenient hearing. The blade wasn't for him, not really. It was for the quiet. It was to ensure the hum of the station went back to being just a hum, a meaningless background noise that nobody ever had to truly listen to again. To stop the truth from ever getting a channel to broadcast on. Then her head tilted just a fraction. The light on her neck pulsed once, a little faster. Your termination has been deemed an unacceptable risk, she said, her tone unchanged, as if she were reading from a technical spec. The political cost is too high. The blade didn't move. Her grip on it didn't loosen. But her explanation began, and it sounded less like a confession and more like a technician reading a diagnostic report for a system on the verge of catastrophic failure. She called it the reprisal cascade. It was one of those brilliant, terrifying pieces of political engineering that looks perfect on a schematic. A mutually assured destruction protocol, baked so deep into the station's core operating systems that not even the station commander could disable it. The treaty between humanity and the Valari Confederacy was young, brittle. Trust was a commodity in short supply, so they built a watchdog, a set of interlinked deadman switches. Thomas Harper, low-level communications technician, was now a primary trigger. His official personnel file was unremarkable. But buried in the subroutines was a biological signature lock, tied to his vital signs. His heartbeat was a live wire in a complex circuit. If it stopped without the proper, multifaceted cryptographic shutdown sequence, a sequence only a handful of people in two governments were supposed to possess, the system would not interpret it as a tragic accident or a lone murder. It would read it as an act of war. The station's defense grid would immediately assume a Valari assassination and launch a full salvo of torpedoes at the nearest Confed outpost. Their systems, receiving that launch confirmation, would see a human first strike and would reciprocate without a second's hesitation. The feedback loop would be instantaneous and total. It was a doomsday device with a person at its center. He wasn't a man. He was a failsafe, a living, breathing political tripwire. All those ignored reports, all that data screaming in his head. It was him unconsciously documenting the very architecture that was now, ironically, the only thing keeping him alive. The people who sent her wanted him gone. His meticulous logs were a threat to their operation, a loose thread on a very expensive sweater. But they'd forgotten what sweater they were wearing. Or they'd assumed the safeguards were theoretical, bureaucratic noise. They were wrong. His death wouldn't be a quiet solution. It would be the loudest event in the sector in a generation. A fire alarm that could not be silenced. It wouldn't just kill him. It would expose the conspiracy in a blast of radiation and debris, painting a target on everyone involved with a brush too big to hide from. Zarath's mission parameters had just encountered a critical error. Her contract was void. Her payment was worthless. She wasn't just an assassin in that moment. She was a strategist staring at a galactic chessboard where the most valuable piece was a pawn, who didn't know he was in the game. His next heartbeat was checkmate for someone. The equation was impossible. Kill him and she dies in the ensuing firestorm. Her employers hunted across the stars for triggering a war. Don't kill him and she fails her contract, which for a professional of her caliber came with its own set of terminal consequences. His value had flipped. It was no longer in the work his hands could do or the reports he could file. His value was now purely negative. It existed in the immense universe-shattering cost of his absence. The chaos his death would create was a price tag so high, not even a Shadow War profiteer could afford it. She finally lowered the blade. The motion was slow, deliberate. The cyan glow of her tattoos seemed to soften, the rhythm shifting from a combat-ready staccato to something more pensive, like a processor cooling down after a heavy calculation. "There is a procedure," she said, her voice still that flat, efficient instrument. "A Valari legal mechanism. It is not elegant. It is a last resort for situations of mutually incompatible survival." She explained it without a shred of sentiment. It was a clause, a sub-paragraph. The witness-consort bond. It was a forced alliance, recognized in the very same treaty frameworks that contained the reprisal cascade. If an individual became a vital witness to a crime that threatened the treaty itself, and was simultaneously under threat of death from the perpetrators, they could be bound to an agent of the state for protection. In this case, the agent was her, and the state involved was unclear. The bond would last for one solar day, a full rotation of the station. If they failed to resolve the threat within that time, the bond became permanent. A lifelong tether. He would be consigned to a life attached to a professional killer, and she would be saddled with the living, breathing alarm system she'd been sent to disconnect. It wasn't about trust. It wasn't about wanting to work together. It was a brutal mathematical assessment of available options. It was the only move on the board that didn't result in immediate annihilation for both of them. She was offering him a choice between certain death right now and a very uncertain and likely terrifying partnership with a countdown timer attached. His protection would come from her proximity. Her survival now depended on his. They would be a single unit in the eyes of the station's legal AI, a shield made from the sheer awkwardness of their shared predicament. It was the least romantic partnership proposal in history. Then she sheathed her blade. The sound was a soft click, final and profound. Trust isn't a switch you flip. It's a bridge you build, plank by shaky plank, over a canyon you can't see the bottom of. Thomas looked at Zarath, at the woman who'd had a blade at his heart 60 seconds ago, and tried to find a place to put that concept. It didn't fit. The only thing that fit was the cold, hard geometry of her proposal. The witness-consort bond. It sounded like a bad title for a cheap romance novel. Not a legal instrument with the power to dictate the rest of his life. She laid it out like she was reading a technical manual for a problematic piece of equipment, which he supposed he was. The Valari legal code had a subclause for moments when the system itself broke down, when a witness was too vital to lose but too dangerous to keep. It was a patch, a workaround. It bound two individuals together under a shared legal identity for a period of one solar day, one full rotation of the station, a 26-hour ceasefire enforced by the station's central AI. The terms were brutally simple. They would be recognized as a single entity. Their movements would be tracked as one. Their safety would be each other's legal responsibility. If they failed to neutralize the threat against him within that time frame, if they didn't expose the conspiracy and get him officially, permanently under protection, the bond didn't just expire. It became permanent. A lifelong tether, he tried to picture it. Him, a jumpy technician who fixed antenna arrays, permanently legally bound to a bioluminescent alien assassin. His life would become her assignment. Her life would become his orbit. There would be no more quiet shifts, no more anonymous bunk. Every decision, from what he ate for breakfast to which corridor he walked down, would be a joint operation. It was a marriage of pure, undeniable necessity, officiated by the cold logic of survival. No love, no choice, just the relentless math of staying alive. His options were a binary as stark as a power switch. Option 1, certain death right now at her hands or the hands of the next freelancer they sent. A quick professional end, followed by a galactic war that would torch civilizations. Option 2, an uncertain partnership with the person who'd just been hired to kill him. A partnership with a timer ticking down to a different kind of life sentence. It was a choice between the end of everything and the end of life as he knew it. This wasn't about trust. The word felt soft and useless here, like bringing a birthday candle to a plasma fire. This was about survival calculus. It was about looking at two horrifying equations and picking the one with a variable you just might be able to solve for. She wasn't asking him to like her. She wasn't asking him to believe her. She was presenting him with data. Her value was her skill, her access, her ability to operate in the shadows that had just tried to consume him. His value was his knowledge, his access logs, his understanding of the station's hidden frequencies. Together they formed a complete data set. Apart, they were just two incompatible errors about to be wiped from the system. The bond offered a perverse kind of protection. His safety was now her primary operational directive, not out of kindness, but because her own survival was now algorithmically linked to his. Anyone coming for him would have to go through her. Their shared danger became a shield. They were two prisoners handcuffed together, forced to cooperate because the alternative was falling off a cliff. Her flat professionalism, her utter lack of emotional salesmanship, was the only thing that made the offer remotely believable. She wasn't trying to convince him. She was stating facts, and beneath that clinical exterior he sensed it, a flicker of her own stake in this. She'd been sent on a contract that was now impossible to fulfill without self-immolation. Her reputation, her standing, perhaps her own life were also on the line. She wasn't saving him. She was salvaging a mission that had catastrophically malfunctioned. He was a vital component she couldn't afford to lose. The resolution was as unceremonious as the proposal. There was no handshake. No pledge of loyalty. He gave a single numb nod. Her response was to tap a sequence into a slim datapad on her wrist. A soft chime echoed in the room, acknowledged by a corresponding blink from the station's overhead comms panel. The binding was logged. The clock started. They were now, in the eyes of the law and the station's AI, an official temporary unit. The partnership was forged, not in trust but in the cold, hard recognition of a shared problem. They were allies by law, not by choice. An assassin and her target, now a team with a 26-hour expiration date. Then she looked at him, her head tilting in that assessing way. "We need to disappear you," she stated. The first step was to make Thomas Harper officially, medically, and convincingly dead. It was time to use the station's own emergency protocols against it. What does it take to die without actually dying? It feels a lot like the floor dropping out from under you, and then the ceiling, and then the air in your lungs. One moment Thomas was standing in his workshop, heart hammering against his ribs. The next, a sharp pinch in his neck. Her hand, steady and impersonal. The world didn't go black. It went cold and slow. A thick, syrupy paralysis seized his muscles. His lungs forgot their job. His heart stuttered, then stopped its frantic rhythm. He was a machine unplugged from the wall. The last thing he saw was Zareth's face, lean and focused, checking a chronometer on her wrist. No panic, no regret. Just timing. Station medical protocols are a well-oiled machine. Predictable. They exist for a reason. A life signs alert pings from a citizen's implanted biomonitor. The system doesn't question it. It doesn't ask if the heart failure is real or chemically induced. It just reacts. Alarms blared through the sector, a sound that cut through the station's ambient hum like a knife. Lights strobed in the corridor outside his door. The response was immediate. A clatter of boots and the low whine of an emergency med unit on its guided track. Chaos, but an organized chaos. A script everyone had drilled for. Zareth moved through this script like she'd written it herself. She was a ghost in the machinery. As the med team burst in, she was already fading into a maintenance alcove, her dark clothing and still posture making her just another piece of equipment. They swarmed Thomas, their training taking over. They saw a man in arrest. They saw a problem to be solved. They did not see the assassin standing 3 meters away, watching them work, her expression as neutral as a diagnostic screen. They loaded his limp body onto the gurney, The medical bots already pounding on his chest, injecting standard stimulants that would do nothing against her specialized paralytic. He was clinically verifiably dead. For 7 minutes and 18 seconds, according to her chronometer. His extraction was a lesson in using the system's own momentum against it. The med team rushed his body toward the central med bay, a choreographed sprint of urgency. Zarath moved with them, a shadow in their wake. She knew the route. She knew where the security cameras' blind spots were, where the corridors narrowed, where the automated cart traffic always created a bottleneck. As they turned a corner, a supply cart mistimed its crossing, blocking the hallway for precisely 9 seconds. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated obstruction. In that brief window of confusion and shouted instructions, she was there. A quick, precise movement. A panel in the wall slid open. A forgotten conduit access point she'd mapped days ago. His body was transferred from the bright, noisy hallway into the silent, dusty darkness in less than 3 heartbeats. The panel slid shut. The med team, their focus on the blocked cart and their ticking clock, never noticed the weight on their Gerster had subtly lightened. They rushed onward, toward a medbay that would record the tragic, unsuccessful resuscitation of technician Thomas Harper. His old life ended on a medbay cot with a team of strangers working over an empty shell. His new one began in the musty, cold air of Secured Storage Section 7, Sublet 12. The paralytic wore off slowly, the feeling returning to his limbs in a painful, prickling rush. He drew a ragged, involuntary breath, his body remembering how to live. He was on a cold deck plate, surrounded by stacks of plastic crates labeled with parts numbers he recognized, spare relays, obsolete circuit boards. The air smelled of ozone and dust. Zarath stood over him, administering a counteragent with the same efficiency she'd used to stop his heart. "You are deceased," she informed him, her voice flat. "The station log confirms it. Your funeral is scheduled for cycle 1872. Standard pension benefits will be transferred to your designated beneficiary." The station would mourn him. A minor notice on the daily bulletin. A few colleagues would shake their heads over synthetic coffee, mentioning his diligence, his quietness. Maybe someone would wonder briefly about the stress of the job. The conspiracy, watching from whatever shadowy channels they operated in, would relax. The loose end had been tied off. The problem had been solved. The threat of his inconvenient hearing had been permanently silenced. They believed their weapon had worked perfectly. They were ghosts now, 2 non-persons operating in the gaps of official reality. Their existence was a glitch the system hadn't found yet. Secured Storage Section 7, Sublet 12 was their new base of operations, a cramped, windowless cube at the very edge of the station's habitable zone. It was cold. The lighting was a single, flickering amber strip, but it was off the grid, untracked, their own private pocket of unreality. It became their war room. Then she nodded to the datapad she'd placed on a crate between them. It displayed his own maintenance logs, the very files that had started all this. The thousands of pages of routine diagnostics, error reports, and system checks. "Now," Zarath said, her bioluminescent tattoos casting a soft blue light on the screen. "We parse the data. Show me the noise. What secrets hide in plain sight within the hum of a quantum relay? Sometimes the most dangerous truth wears the dull clothes of a routine diagnostic." In the flickering amber light of their storage sublet, Thomas watched his own life's work scroll across the datapad. Line after line of maintenance logs, signal strengths, error codes, power fluctuations. The tedious paperwork of keeping a station alive. He knew every line. He'd written them, but he'd never really read them. Not like this. Not with an assassin's cool eyes looking over his shoulder, seeing the pattern he'd missed. To him, it was just data. To her, it was a treasure trove. Zarath's fingers moved across the screen, isolating fragments he'd flagged as anomalies. A harmonic resonance in the long-range comms that didn't match any known stellar event. A power draw in a supposedly dormant cargo bay that synced perfectly with scheduled diplomatic receptions. A data packet with an encryption wrapper that was just a little too complex. A little too military grade for simple station keeping. He'd logged them all dutifully and filed them away. Glitches. System noise. She began to decrypt the fragments. The harmonic resonance wasn't noise. It was a mask. A specific frequency used to hide the engine signatures of ships running dark. Ships that weren't on any official manifest. The unusual power draw? It synced with those receptions because that's when the loading docks were empty. The perfect cover to move heavy. Shielded crates marked as diplomatic gifts. The over-encrypted packets unfolded into shipping manifests, coordinates, delivery schedules, payment authorizations. They weren't just arming one side. The manifest showed weapons flowing to extremist factions on both sides of the territorial boundary, advanced plasma rifles to a human separatist cell, Confed sonic disruptors to a Volari hardline group. The diplomatic channels, the sacred, secure lines meant for peace talks, had been corrupted, turned into a covert logistics network for a war machine. His daily work, his boring, meticulous checklists, had been a constant, unnoticed audit of the entire conspiracy. For 8 months, he'd been documenting their every move without understanding what he was seeing. He was the camera in the room, recording everything. His lens focused on the wrong subject. Zarath pieced it together with a terrifying clarity. She cross-referenced dates. The shipments increased in volume and frequency, precisely as peace negotiations between the governments entered their most critical phases. The more the diplomats talked, the more weapons flowed. It was a perverse kind of symmetry. The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't just a few rogue officers. The financial records buried in the data pointed to a network. High-ranking officials from both governments, skimming funds, authorizing blind-eye policies, commercial shipping entities providing logistical support for a hefty off-the-books fee. Dozens of weapon suppliers from major corporations to back-alley armories, all feeding into the same pipeline. This wasn't a failure of diplomacy. It wasn't a tragedy of miscommunication. It was the intended product. War itself was the commodity. The peace talks were just the marketplace where the futures were being traded. The profits were astronomical. The human cost was just a line item. His diligence, his stubborn refusal to let a glitch go unfiled, had created an accidental, perfect record of galactic treason. He hadn't been trying to be a hero. He was just a man who liked his systems to run clean. That fastidiousness had built a case that could topple governments. The proof was all here, in the noise he'd spent his career listening to. They sat in silence for a long moment, the truth of it settling over the cold storage unit like a fine dust. They had it. The entire conspiracy, laid bare in data points and transaction logs, but having the evidence and being able to use it were two very different problems. The conspirators had administrative access to the communication networks. Any attempt to transmit this data through normal diplomatic channels would be intercepted, scrubbed, and denied before it reached anyone who mattered. They'd be sending their confession directly to the people who wrote it. Then a realization dawned, cold and sharp. The evidence couldn't be sent. It was too big, too complex, too easy to block and erase. It had to be delivered. It had to be placed directly into the hands of the only people with the power to act. The heads of state on both sides, simultaneously. They needed a channel they couldn't control, a protocol they couldn't corrupt. They needed to bypass the entire compromised system. They needed to go outside. They looked at each other, the same impossible thought connecting them. The evidence wasn't on the data pad anymore. The evidence was the man sitting on the cold floor. His body was the key. What if your mind isn't just for thinking anymore? What if it becomes the message itself, the envelope and the letter, the signal and the source? Thomas stood in that cold storage unit, and for the first time, he truly understood what the months of exposure had done to him. It wasn't just about hearing a hum nobody else could. The treaty key frequencies, those complex encryption algorithms he'd been swimming in every day, hadn't just been background noise. They'd been rewiring him. His neural pathways weren't just carrying thoughts anymore. They'd begun to mimic the very structures of the quantum relays he maintained. His body was no longer just a vessel for a technician's worries and coffee breaks. It was a biological transmitter, a living, breathing archive of the conspiracy's entire operation. Zarath laid out the plan with a grim focus. They couldn't send the data. The network was theirs. Any packet, any signal, any whisper would be caught, torn apart, and buried by the very people they were trying to expose. They had to go over their heads. They had to go around the entire compromised system. The emergency protocols buried in the treaty were their only shot. These were the protocols designed for Armageddon, for the moment when all other channels were lost. They allowed for a direct, Priority 1 broadcast, straight to the offices of the two people who needed to see it most: the commander of Earth's interstellar forces and the head of the Volari High Council. A simultaneous transmission, impossible to block, impossible to intercept. and all channels scream from the heart of the station itself. But there was a catch. The transmission couldn't be a file transfer. The bandwidth needed for that much raw data, fast enough to beat any attempt to stop it, would burn out every relay on the station. It would be like trying to force an ocean through a drinking straw. The data had to be compressed, refined, made pristine and efficient. And the only device capable of that was him. The plan was simple and terrifying. He would not send the data. He would become the data. His consciousness, his very self, would be the signal, the evidence of weapons shipments, the corrupted financial logs, the secret manifests, all of it, every byte he'd accidentally recorded, would be translated into the unique harmonic language of his own reshaped brain. He would be the living proof. The process was not gentle. Zarath wired him into a makeshift interface, jury-rigged from spare parts in the storage unit. There was no fancy chair, no clean white room. He sat on the cold deck, back against a crate of obsolete circuit boards.
She explained it as she worked.
For 37 seconds, his consciousness would dissolve. His thoughts, his memories, his sense of self. It would all be unmade, converted into pure structured information. He wouldn't be Thomas Harper, technician. He would be a broadcast, a beam of thought aimed at 2 points light years apart. It was a terrifying, transcendent act of diplomatic sacrifice. He was agreeing to stop existing, if only for half a minute, on the chance that what was left of him when he came back would be enough. He focused on the quantum relay maintenance protocols. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. It was the only rhythm he had left that felt like his own. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the coming silence. Zarath gave him a final measuring look. No words of encouragement. No false promises. Just a professional nod. Then her hand moved on the console. The world didn't end. It unraveled. It started as a high-pitched whine in the center of his skull, a tone so pure it felt like a physical drill. Then the sensation spread. His sight didn't go black. It pixelated, fracturing into a billion points of colored light. Each one a data point, a transaction, a line of code from his own logs. He could feel his memories not as stories but as packets, being queued and prioritized for transmission. The taste of synthetic coffee became a string of chemical formulae. The sound of the station's hum resolved into its complete harmonic spectrum, a chart he could read with a part of his mind he never knew he had. There was no fear. There was no Thomas. There was only the flow, the signal. He was a river of light pouring through the station's main comms array, feeling its amplifiers kick in, boosting him, refining him. He was a bullet of truth fired from a cosmic rifle. He felt his essence split, one stream racing toward the blue-green marble of Earth, the other shooting toward the crystalline structures of the Valari homeworld. For 37 seconds he was everywhere and nowhere. He was the data. He was the proof. He was the silent scream finally given a voice. Then, like a rubber band stretched too far and suddenly released, it snapped. The flow reversed. The pixels of light swirled and coalesced. Sensation crashed back into him. The cold of the deck, the smell of ozone, the ache in his muscles from sitting too still. He drew a ragged, shuddering breath, his body convulsing as it remembered how to be a body. He was back in the storage unit. He was Thomas Harper again. Mostly. The truth was gone from him. Transmitted. It had traveled on a beam of his own thought across light years, directly into the secure terminals of the two most powerful offices in settled space. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean. The data was still there in his mind, but it was inert now, like a book he'd read so many times he'd memorized it. The living, painful urgency of it was gone. He looked at his hands, half expecting to see light bleeding from his fingertips. They were just hands. But he was different. The journey had left a mark on him, a permanent change in his internal frequency. The hum was still there, but it was his own now. A quiet personal vibration. He had given himself to the signal, and the signal had given him back, forever altered. Then the station's main alarm began to blare. A different sound entirely. Not a medical alert, not a fire warning. This was a general alert, a priority one, system-wide klaxon that meant something fundamental had just shifted in the political landscape. The transmission had been received. The data had hit its targets. The aftermath was beginning. What happens when a conspiracy unravels at the speed of thought? Imagine a dam, carefully constructed over years with layers of secrecy and lies, and then someone pulls the single plug at its base. That's what that transmission was. A plug pull. It hit the highest councils on Earth and the Valari homeworld simultaneously, bypassing every filter, every aid, every compromised official who would have normally intercept and bury it. The data didn't arrive as a formal report. It arrived as a raw, undeniable dump of truth directly into the command interfaces of the two most powerful people in settled space. There was no covering it up, no dismissing it as a glitch. It was the entire conspiracy laid bare. The evidence was a sledgehammer. High-ranking officials, comfortably entrenched in their power, found their names and authorization codes attached to illegal weapons shipments. Commercial shipping entities whose profits had soared were exposed for providing logistical support to terrorists on both sides. The suppliers, from massive corporations to back-alley armories, were identified, their financial trails mapped in excruciating detail. The scale of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a few bad apples. It was a systemic rot, a network of profit that had woven itself into the very fabric of interstellar relations. The war machine, so carefully primed and funded, ground to a screeching, sudden halt. Treaties that were moments from being torn up were suddenly reinforced. Fleet movements were canceled. The architects of the conflict, who had operated from the safety of shadows in boardrooms, were suddenly terribly vulnerable. Their protection evaporated with the press of a key. Their profits, the entire reason for the exercise, vanished into a cloud of frozen assets and criminal investigations. For Thomas, sitting on the cold floor of a storage unit, the shift was just as profound. The station-wide alarm wasn't a threat anymore. It was a notification. He was no longer a target. The invisible crosshairs that had been on his back for weeks simply faded away. He was now the witness. The man who had, quite by accident, saved two civilizations from a war they didn't want and didn't know they were being sold. His identity underwent a seismic shift. He was no longer Thomas Harper, disposable technician, a line item in a station's personnel budget. He was Thomas Harper, indispensable asset, a living historical record, a one-of-a-kind biological artifact. The reprisal cascade, that terrifying piece of political engineering, had protected his physical body. It was the system's blunt mechanical response to a threat. It was a wall. But his actions, his stubborn diligence, and his willingness to dissolve his own consciousness into a signal were what defined him. The system kept him alive. He chose what to do with that life. He became more than a failsafe. He became the key that unlocked the entire trap. The resolution was swift and merciless. The conspiracy was broken. The network was dismantled, its members arrested, its financial structures seized. The elaborate house of cards, built on greed and the assumption that no one was really paying attention, collapsed under the weight of its own evidence. The peace, so precariously held, was secured. For now. Then the immediate euphoria of survival faded, replaced by a quieter, more complicated reality. He and Zareth were still in a cold storage unit. The station alarm had stopped blaring, replaced by the normal, steady hum. But they were still bound together. The witness-consort bond was still active, its legal countdown ticking away the final hours of its mandated partnership. They had succeeded. They had neutralized the threat. The purpose of the bond was fulfilled. But the legal mechanism didn't just dissolve on its own. It required formal dissolution. They had to face the consequences of their forced alliance, to stand before whatever authorities were left standing and explain what they had done, how they had done it, and why a low-level tech was now legally tethered to a Valari assassin. The immediate danger was over. The paperwork, however, was just beginning. They sat in the dim light, two very different people who had shared an experience that would link them forever, listening to the station slowly return to a normal that neither of them would ever recognize again. The bond had been their shield. Now they had to figure out what it had made them. What is a life when it's rewired for diplomacy? Thomas Harper, communications technician, was officially retired. The man who remained was something else. The treaty key frequencies had integrated with his neural pathways during thousands of hours of routine maintenance, and that integration was permanent. His nervous system was no longer just a collection of neurons and synapses. It was a living archive of evidence, a biological decryption matrix. He could still hear the station's hum, but now it felt like a part of his own internal rhythm. A quiet, personal vibration that was as much him as his own heartbeat. It wasn't a tool he used anymore. It was a layer of his being. He was a living relic now, a human instrument of interstellar communication. His value had undergone a complete transmutation. The skills that had defined his entire adult life, diagnosing faulty relays, recalibrating antenna arrays, writing up maintenance reports, were obsolete. He could probably still do the work, but no one would ever let him near a standard comms panel again. He was too valuable. His worth was no longer in his hands or his technical manuals. It was biological, political. He was a unique asset, a one-of-a-kind piece of diplomatic hardware. A key that couldn't be copied. A witness who couldn't be discredited, because the evidence was literally wired into his brain. He was the ultimate secure channel. Zareth watched him from across the storage unit. The cyan glow of her tattoos was subdued, a slow, calm pulse. She acknowledged the victory, the successful exposure of the conspiracy, with a simple, professional nod. But her eyes, those flat assessing instruments, held something new, a recognition of the profound personal cost. She saw the hollowness in his gaze, the way he sometimes stared at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. He had saved the galaxy, but the man who'd started this was gone, fundamentally altered by the process. It was a sacrifice she understood, a line item on a balance sheet that was never about profit, only survival. The official notification came through on her datapad with a soft chime, a string of legal codes and confirmation numbers. The witness-consort bond was dissolved. The threat had been neutralized. The legal necessity that had bound them together for a single solar day was over. The countdown timer that had hung over their heads, threatening a lifelong tether, simply vanished from the screen. They were free. The contract was void. The law had no more claim on their association. They were free of legal obligation, but bound by something far less definable and far more permanent. A shared experience that had carved a channel between them. They had faced death, bureaucracy, and the unraveling of their own identities together. You don't just walk away from that. The bond had been a chain of necessity. What remained was a connection forged in the white-hot crucible of mutual survival. It was quieter, more complicated. His new reality began with testimony, a lot of it. Security officials, now verified as clean and reporting directly to the highest levels of command, demanded his account. He had to sit in cold, brightly lit interrogation rooms, or debriefing rooms as they politely called them, and explain how he'd accidentally saved the galaxy. He started with a cup of bad coffee, the synthetic brew tasting more bitter than ever, and tried to find words for the impossible. He talked about signal harmonics and power fluctuations. He described the feeling of his consciousness dissolving into a beam of light. The officials took notes. They rarely blinked. His career as he knew it was over. There would be no return to Sector 7G, no more troubleshooting faulty relays. The resolution to his professional life was a pivot he never could have imagined. His new title, when it finally came through, was Diplomatic Liaison Special Communications. In practice, it meant he was a conduit, a living, breathing interface for the most sensitive, high-level talks between governments. His unique biology made him the most secure method of information transfer in known space. His job was to listen, to absorb, and to transmit, not with machines, but with his own reshaped mind. He was a human hard drive with a security clearance that couldn't be hacked. Then, after a particularly long session of testimony that left his head buzzing with legal terminology and exhaustion, Zareth approached him. The official business was done for the day. The authorities had left. They were just two people standing in a sterile hallway, the echoes of their shared crisis fading around them. She looked at him, her head tilting in that familiar assessing way. "You require sustenance," she stated, her voice its usual flat cadence. But then she added something that wasn't in any manual. "I know a place that serves edible protein for both our species. The chairs are adequate." It was an invitation, a suggestion of a meal. The complexities of it were immense. Cross-cultural dining protocols, biological compatibility of foodstuffs, the unspoken rules of a meal between a human technician turned diplomatic asset and a Valari assassin. It was a new kind of mission, with far more ambiguous parameters. She was navigating it the only way she knew how, with a straightforward statement of fact and a quiet offer of company. What lingers after the adrenaline fades is the silence that follows the alarm. For Thomas Harper, it's the quiet hum of an interrogation room, the sterile scent of recycled air, and the bitter taste of bad coffee from a disposable cup. Security officials, their faces set in neutral professional masks, demand his testimony. This is the public reckoning. It's not a dramatic trial before a galactic court. It's a series of small, quiet rooms. It's signing forms. It's repeating the same story for the 10th time to a new panel of analysts who weren't cleared for the information the first 9 times. The aftermath of saving the galaxy turns out to be mostly paperwork. Explaining a galactic conspiracy doesn't start with a grand speech. It starts with a sip of lukewarm coffee that tastes like burnt wiring. He has to begin with the small things. A flicker in a power reading, a weird echo in a comms check. The simplicity of those initial observations feels absurd when held up against the complexity of what they spiraled into. He describes the hum in his head, the data screaming to be heard, and watches the officials exchange glances. They write it down. Their pens scratch against data pads. He tries to explain what it felt like to become a signal, to have his consciousness unmade and fired across space. The words feel inadequate. They always will. The contrast is stark. His simple questions about system noise led to answers involving intergovernmental corruption, illegal arms deals, and his own biological repurposing. Zarath sits through some of these sessions. Her presence is a quiet anchor in the sterile chaos. Her humor is a dry, subtle thing, a coping mechanism that reveals a genuine respect forged in their shared crisis. An official asks her to state her profession for the record. Assassin, she says, her voice flat. Then, after a beat, she adds, and conflict resolution specialist. The official blinks, unsure how to notate that. A tiny, almost invisible smile touches her lips. It's not a joke, not really. It's the grim truth of what they've been through. Her professionalism masks a bond that can't be easily categorized. They navigated an impossible situation and came out the other side. Not as friends, but as something new. Their relationship is a new model, a blueprint for alliance born from the ashes of attempted assassination. They are proof that trust isn't a prerequisite for cooperation. Sometimes it's a byproduct of shared survival. They operated on a framework of mutual need, a cold calculus that somehow warmed into a working partnership. He knows the precise angle of her head when she's assessing a threat. She knows the way he rubs his thumb against his forefinger when he's concentrating on a difficult problem. These are the small currencies of their new normal. They don't need to like each other. They just know they work. The galaxy is safer, but it's a fragile kind of safe. The conspiracy is broken, its leaders in custody, its financial network seized, but the conditions that allowed it to flourish are still there. Greed, mistrust. The vast dark spaces between stars where deals can be made without witnesses. The peace is real, but it's not permanent. It's a tense, watchful quiet. Like the moment after a loud noise when you're still waiting for the echo. The danger hasn't vanished. It's just changed its shape. It's quieter now. More patient. Vigilance is the price of this peace, and Thomas Harper is now part of that price. His life is the subscription fee. His old self was the down payment. His new role as a living conduit, a diplomatic asset, means his vigilance is no longer a choice. It's his job description. He is permanently on duty. His senses are now instruments of state security. The hum in his head is a tool he must constantly monitor. He's both the watchman and the watchtower. It's a weight he will carry from now on. The freedom he fought for is a freedom defined by constant awareness. The resolution isn't a neat ending. It's a beginning. The most important changes, the ones that truly matter, often start with the simplest questions. A technician asking why a sound is slightly off. A person wondering about a flicker on a screen. It's the refusal to accept glitch as a final answer. That stubborn, quiet curiosity is what undid an entire network of lies. It's a reminder that you don't need grand power to create grand change. You just need to pay attention to the small things everyone else has learned to ignore. Then they walk out of the debriefing room, the latest session finally over. The hallway is empty. The station hums its normal, steady hum. He feels the vibration through the soles of his boots. A familiar song he now understands on a cellular level. She falls into step beside him, a silent matching rhythm. They don't speak. They just walk. The future isn't a cleared path. It's a series of complicated, uncharted moments. Their next one involves finding a meal that won't poison either of them, navigating the silent language of cross-cultural menus, and the unspoken rules of a shared table. They move toward it together, one step at a time, one complicated dinner at a time. Sometimes salvation doesn't arrive as a hero. It shows up holding a blade to your throat. The most profound threats aren't found in shadowy conspiracies, but buried deep inside the hum of machinery you're trained to ignore. That flicker on a screen, that echo in the comms, the data point everyone calls a glitch. That's where the truth lives. Don't dismiss the ordinary. Pay attention to the routine. The next time you hear that familiar sound, that background noise you've learned to tune out, lean in. Listen closer. The universe speaks in frequencies most people have forgotten how to hear.